with further opportunities to formally publish the papers after a peer review process through ACUADS early next year. But I'd like to begin by acknowledging the people of the Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, on whose unceded lands RMIT University conducts its business. And here for me in beautiful but wet Nyunone country in southeast Lutruwita. We respectfully acknowledge their elders past and present, and the traditional custodians of the lands and waters across Australia and indeed overseas, where RMIT conducts its business. So a very, I think, appropriate framing for this final session of the local and global COVID networks theme. And it is my great pleasure to hand across to Professor David Cross, Dr. Cameron Bishop, Dr. Katie Lee and Dr. Fiona Hillary for presenting the first paper. Over to you.
Fantastic. Sorry, everybody. This is a four-headed hydra, so there's four different voices coming through in this presentation, and I'll get things up and running. So Stefan Hertmans, in his text Masters of Unpredictability, Academies and Art Education, outlines the fundamental disconnect between academic bureaucracies and the teaching of art. Faced with an imperative, in his words, to regulate and predict everything, he suggests the solution to this cultural chasm is for art academics to demand independence, to insist on the fundamental value of open goals without finality. While posing this dilemma as a problem for educational bureaucracy, not a problem for art, Hertmans suggests that art educators need to push back on the instrumentalized bureaucratic imperative and simply demand that experimental cognition drive the tertiary learning ethos. While the idea of the dog wagging the tail seems obviously prescient, the simple prescription that the solution is as basic as educating the machine runs aground when the machine is calibrated, actually structured, to neutralize the value of experimental cognition. Rather than listen to a heartfelt treatise on art for art's sake and the necessity for academic independence, institutions are far more likely to close programs that will not play ball with the gospel of job readiness. As a sector, we share a common challenge of being organisationally isolated within each tertiary environment where our values and ethos are increasingly marginalised and seen as at best quaint and at worst antithetical. Our strength is evident in forums such as ACUADS and DDCA, but this disguises the dilution within each tertiary provider. How then might we play to our strengths and not run aground following Hertmans' suggestion to talk with the taxman about poetry? The answer is both obvious and complex, inventing new collaborative models across universities. Beyond ARC and sector bodies such as ACUADS, the imperative to collaborate is neutered by the competitive nature of universities. In such an environment, it is difficult to convince management to support pan-university research projects where the CI role is split across multiple fronts. Indeed, the very nature of the designation chief investigator hinders the possibility of shared agency. But it is precisely in new pan-university research projects that resilient economies of scale can be built. While ARC linkage and discovery projects clearly serve to build collaboration, what new approaches might be offered whereby a number of institutions can come together to collectively build research capacity, to develop innovative consortia projects connecting industry and community? Guest speaker at yesterday's DDCA forum, David McGravy, spoke about the UK New Artist Initiative, jointly developed by 4 universities in the UK, which is a registered charity focused on championing the next generation of creativity, supporting collaboration and intercultural dialogue, and generally ensuring a vibrant and diverse creative future for the UK. Considering each university in that consortia is still in competition with one another for students, points to the value of a shared approach rather than distracts from it. Such an approach within our local context could see a pan-university HDR supervision model as against a competitive one, and the formation of substantial national research clusters properly resourced, rather than our current reality of mostly atomised entities scattered across the sector, struggling consistently to garner support. Developed as MOUs or indeed something more elegant, these pan-university structures, even a new artist initiative, would serve to strengthen each partner against the vagaries of one university's decision-making and also create the conditions for much greater economies of scale in terms of research ambition. In loosening a student's identification with a university, greater emphasis might or could be placed on the discipline and on the all-important goals of industry community engagement. But for such a shift to occur, we need to derive the overarching ethos of competition. All right, over to you, Katie.
It's important to demythologize the idea that artists thrive working alone. It's especially a romantic notion, emerging from the cliche of an artist in their garret, productive when lonely and depressed. In fact, many artists thrive working in community, and unsurprisingly often need to be happy in order to be creative. Having the opportunity to collaborate with other artists should be critical to any learning environment and form the basis of any meaningful introduction to an arts industry. I hold this position as a visual artist, well used to the individualistic meritocracy to which many artists, I believe, accidentally subscribe. Unlike other industries, film, architecture, theatre, dance, many visual artists are educated in and still seem wedded to the notion that being an artist is akin to being a one-man band. If we are discovered, all our pesky problems will go away. However, much of our ambition, our work outscales this quaint notion. So too does the scale and economy of our local art market, which in Australia cannot necessarily financially support the number of excellent artists that we have. This is before we even begin to follow the money and analyse more carefully who it is exactly that we've outsourced and indexed our sense of self-worth and notion of success to. Many young undergraduate students enrol in the creative arts arrive hoping to find this magic arts industry that will value their individual creative contribution and often begin an art school education with little awareness of what an arts industry actually is, let alone what it could be. This disconnect is especially acute for high school leavers who go from studying self-expression and singular artists that they deem famous in year 12, only to be told that there is little chance of that happening to them and to be overwhelmed by a different set of targets and agendas once their higher education begins, including very poor statistics that they will survive, as artists that is. However, I would like to propose a different interpretation of these figures. Despite the data touted by educational institutions or governments about the lack of jobs in the creative arts and the small number of students who continue in the field, I don't believe the hard data captures the rich ecology that artists create for themselves and then work within. It's important to recognise this as we are in an era where hard data is constantly being used against us. My position on this emerged from scarcity. I went to art school in Hobart, Tasmania during the 90s recession. There were very few galleries, zero external opportunities, no red carpet waiting at the end of my degree. In fact, as many who have a BFA might remember, we affectionately called it a Bachelor of Fuck All. When faced with a series of closed and closing doors, I banded together with a very motley crew and opened up an artist collective in the Salamanca Arts Centre amongst wool shops and secondhand bookstores. In it, we invited other art students to sell their work to the public direct. I'm shocked to say two things of this venture. One, I financially supported myself selling my artwork through my undergraduate studies. And two, the collective's actually still there. Since then, I've continued to work in collaborative environments, for example, artist-run spaces run by committees of practicing artists such as Conical Inc. and Westspace. These spaces in turn offer opportunities for artists to collaborate and make lateral relationships between what are otherwise very hierarchical structures within the professional ladder. These traditional professional hierarchies, although prestigious, are still limiting to many artists. For example, artists who have shown at major institutions and represented by private galleries still want to work in project spaces such as Conical because the emphasis was on, as David described, experimental cognition. This phenomenon, a kind of professional bracket creep, saw artists run spaces such as Conical no longer supporting only emerging artists, but also the experimentally cognitive illiterati. This was captured by our committee-led exhibition Bracket Creep, which was previously pictured on the slideshow, in which the office space of Conical was temporarily located upside down in the ceiling, noting the heavy administrative overlay as conceptual praxis. Projects initiated by spaces such as Westbase and Conical model the way collaborations operate to generate opportunities. For example, the mentorship program run over a 2-year period at Conical called 3 Square involved 3 mentors from 3 Melbourne universities or art schools and 6 emerging artists. Each group worked together creating new work, building new relationships and establishing and expanding audiences across generations and institutions. Tiger, a West-based initiative, paired 6 established artists with any artist of their choosing, likewise creating new networks and collaborative relationships within a series of exhibitions. Artists invited to participate in these ventures use the opportunity to expand their own collaborative and experimental processes and networks. These kind of initiatives build networks, dialogue and culture and generate opportunities. By sharing these opportunities horizontally, a genuine arts ecology emerges, whereby cross-intersections of the community are brought into relationship, strengthening and making more visible outcomes. At very few times during this period would I have ticked a box on the census saying my income came from art. However, my identity, my community and my creative practice absolutely did. It's imperative that higher education institutions show emerging artists the kinds of opportunities that can come from working collaboratively, and even more importantly, how large-scale projects and events are driven from and by these relationships. By working with others, artists are able to infiltrate the system. Collaborative models become boreas, allowing artists to go bigger and stage even larger events, creating the industry into which we can then participate, work and belong.
Consortia building across universities is not new work, it's critical work. Our allegiance must be to the manifestation of consortia. In her recent publication, Natalie Lovelace poses an insightful question for us to consider. Quote, how might we, workers in the university, orient ourselves in our current project of everyday academic life under the sign of the Anthropocene and its others, the Plantationocene, the Thulacene? How might we inhabit human, non-human, never been human and more than human social webs differently at all scales of existence? We have a shared interest in unearthing new stories, exploring old stories and decentering existing stories of sight.
So how does this, though, in working outside of the bounds of the institutionalised economic imperative, competition, bureaucratic hobbling and alienation work in actuality? Well, it starts in quiet conversation about a site and serendipity. When I first talked to Megan Evans, the curator at Wyndham Art Gallery, about internships at the gallery in 2013, I did this at the behest of the paymasters at Deakin, and of course for the students to build their skill sets in production, curation, administration and unpaid labour. But we stumbled in our conversation and we actually just started talking shit. We talked about the smell of it, the stigma of it, the wildlife that emanates from it. We're actually talking about the Western Treatment Plant, Melbourne's oldest and largest wastewater treatment facility, only a few kilometres south of where we're actually sitting. We bonded over the creative possibilities of what lay behind the 35-kilometre fence line that runs parallel to the freeway. Depending on which way the wind is blowing in Melbourne's west, we all get to smell it from time to time. But what were the stories behind its olfactics? There's the universal and the transversal, scalar and the vectoral. There are steps and relays, channels, locks and threshing machines dealing with the task of diluting and removing pathogens from our wastewater for its safe evacuation, eventually into the sea and nearby farms. There are technological histories here, labour histories that intersect with cultural histories that coincide with colonising infrastructures. It's where a diversity of bird life to rival cakadoos has come to reside for varying periods of time through any given year. This is where the public art project and generative assemblage treatment was conceived in curiosity and conversation. Treatment is now into its 3rd iteration and it's come out of Melbourne Water's plant to stretch from Werribee back up the Heritage main sewer outfall all the way to Science Works, with a brief now to connect the diverse communities the pipeline runs through. Partners include the cities of Wyndham, Hobsons Bay, Science Works and Melbourne Water. Since its first run in 2015, it's supported tens of internships from Deakin. It's set up a curatorial fellowship scheme where emerging creators from the area can work with curators, production staff and artists. It's given invaluable experience to dozens of site coordinators and volunteers from various Wyndham community groups and the council, and it's gifted new insight to thousands of visitors, from bird watchers to artists to academics and the local community, into our wastewater technologies and their histories and the plant's critical importance to the life of Melbourne City. So this consortia that we propose would operate across RMIT, Deakin University, Victoria University, and Hobson's Bay City. I know I've run out of time. We've got a lot more to say. So, Kit?
3 minutes.
3 minutes? Okay. So the kind of consortia that we formed here came about through dialogue between a group of artists, first and foremost. Out of the 2015 and 2017 public art events that ran through the Western Treatment Plant, we've developed numerous public art projects at undergrad level, 5 PhDs that came from artists, writers and researchers making work in response to the site and curatorial themes from different institutions as well. Fiona Hillary's PhD being one of them, but she happens to work at RMIT. So in bringing together a public art project like Treatment, inadvertently and against all instincts, we have been building a multi-institutional assemblage that gives us a model for what Fiona is proposing here. Fiona.
In this consortia, from the confines of the traditional structural barriers of institutions, we're exploring the fence line of the Altona treatment plant that might fence in our effluent, keeping us safe from our own shit, at the same time fencing in an internationally recognised artwork on the brink of disrepair, Agnes Dean's Forest for Australia. What is our role in removing the structural barriers to consortia practices in art education and research, and as active citizens in the world that allow us to address the needs of Dean's Forest collaboratively? Embracing the assemblages of society, human, non-human, more than human, we turn to thinkers like Donna Haraway and Anna Singh. It's all about the marks of care we leave for the future and the on a damaged planet. We know that the creativity and innovation that emerges from a collaborative consortia is generative, not delivering a describable product to industry, instead bringing industry on the journey, exploring the hard questions, creating new stories and new possibilities. The consortium built through Bishop and Cross's work Treatment is a testament to this kind of research assemblage. I can't see the chat, so someone might like to cut in when necessary. We have common goals, live test sites of practice where all members of the consortia coalesce, exploring what it means to be an artist, what it means to be an artist researcher in a neoliberal world, doing the work to maintain practice-led research in a competitive field, doing the work to revitalise a forest for Australia. Through research and pedagogical practices across universities, our allegiance is to the consortia. We're attempting to map an ecology of collaboration against the backdrop of COVID-19 and its challenges. Thinking with Haraway, how do we construct a cyborgian consortia robust enough to transform or transcend our institutional divides?
Thank you, Fiona. I may call an end there if that's okay, in the fairness to the next presenter. Wonderful, wonderful, inspiring opening. So thank you, Katie, David, Cameron, and Fiona. And I think that idea of consortia is critical at this time. Andrew had an excellent question in the chat there. If there is one brief question while we're reflecting on that, around the evidence to prove the value of these consortia. I don't know in that particular case study of Treatment whether you did have a particular approach to the value measurements. And Dave, Cameron, sorry, you're on mute.
I mean, in terms of measuring the traditional metrics that the university use, we sure did have a lot of TRO and TRO outputs, and of course, you know, funding that helped us realise the projects. More important to us was the amount of community involvement from the Wyndham area so far. And in the next iteration, the community involvement from all the way from Wyndham up to Science Works through Hobson's Bay. So we've got numerous organisations on board, and I guess the most gratifying thing about it is actually working with young artists and community groups in that project to open their eyes to what we do as producers, curators, artists, but also to what the Western treatment plant is, its technologies, histories, and the cultures that are key to it. Yeah.
Thank you. I certainly hear a whole range of value measures, value outcomes in what you're describing there for communities, for individuals, for emerging artists. So remarkable work, very, very powerful, and exciting to have these exemplars to build consortia proposals from. Thank you. We do need to move along to the next presentation, and again we may loop back to some of those ideas at the end of this session. So many thanks, David, Cameron, Katie, and Fiona. Our next presenters are Inoka Samarasekara, Katherine Moline, and Zoe Veness. And so, Inoka, I think you may be opening the presentation for us.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate. Let me share my screen. Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Inoka Samarasekara, a PhD candidate from the School of Art and Design, UNSW. The title of my presentation is Reimagining the Cosmopolitanism of Sri Lanka Through Cultural Artifacts. The paper is co-authored by my supervisors, Associate Professor Katherine Moline and Dr. Zoe Veness, School of Art and Design, UNSW. These are the contents of my presentation. Introduction. COVID-19 pandemic has been reshaping the global cultural flows in between the countries and the cultures. The diaspora around the globe have started new dialogues with their nation states, encouraging temporary migrants to return to their homeland. The obstacles appearing in global cultural flows signify the potential for new networks. It seems that new avenues to appreciate the differences and to acknowledge the diversity of different societies. Drawing on Arjun Appadurai's reimagining of cosmopolitanism as a move beyond the insularity and exclusions prompted by cultural difference, this research proposes to reimagine the cosmopolitanism of Sri Lanka as a potential strategy to embrace different cultural identities that has been diluted with the ethnic conflict since the beginning of the 21st century. To rebuild the cosmopolitanism of the different cultures that make up Sri Lanka, the research explores the early cosmopolitanism of historical Sri Lanka through traditional jewellery artifacts. Contextual background. The colonial impacts from the 16th to 19th centuries have transformed the socio-cultural, political, and economical domains of Sri Lanka. This transformation has been enhanced by the globalization at the end of the 20th century. Sri Lanka as an island and a central location of the ancient maritime trade routes of the Indian Ocean has experienced cosmopolitanism with diverse cultures through shipping. The historical cosmopolitanism of Sri Lanka began to dissolve from the 18th century with the influence of the British colonial rule. It impacted for the segregation among different ethnic groups at the end of the 20th century and ended with an ethnic conflict. It diluted the early cosmopolitanism of Sri Lanka at the beginning of the 21st century. Against this background, different external encounters who compete for global power influence Sri Lanka based on its position in the middle of the maritime routes across the Indian Ocean. It is important to nurture the unity of the country, to negotiate these external influences, as well as for the harmony between different local communities. my theoretical framework, the paper proposes the social imaginary as the framework for understanding the socio-cultural transformations of Sri Lanka that has driven by the colonization and globalization. And also it is recognized as a potential framework to create new social imaginaries to counter the adverse impacts of the colonization and the globalization. Drawing from theorists Arjun Appadurai and Charles Taylor, the social imaginary is considered as a key player for these transformations as it exposes the tension between globalization and multiple Sri Lankan modernities. It is the collective agency of the multiple imaginaries of diverse groups of Sri Lanka, shaped by the contemporary forms of modernity. Appadurai suggests that the social imaginary explains the foundation of globalization through his model of global cultural flow. The model of global cultural flows is composed of 5 scapes. Based on this model, Appadurai explains how transnational cultural flows has become one of the central forces of the modern world. His reasoning is that migrated groups tend to invent homelands and to reproduce culture outside their original homeland. He further proposes that recreating a culture remotely sometimes produces ethnic conflicts due to diverse cultural tensions. Appadurai proposes that the critical point is that the unpredictable and disconnected forms, what he calls the scapes, are each subjective to its own constraints and incentives. For example, the pandemic of COVID-19 is currently disclosing the unpredictable and inconsistent healthcare provision internationally. It has observed a congestion in the mobility of people and an acceleration in the flows of images and ideas. The reshaping of the global cultural flows suggests the potential for new networks of social imaginaries. Drawing on Appadurai, the implementation of the projects that expand group identities and large-scale group identities is important to increase the potential scope of embodied experiences of group affinity. To counter the social imaginary of segregation underpinned by the modern nation-state, this paper attempts to reimagine the early cosmopolitanism of Sri Lanka by renewing the embodied cosmopolitan identity of the cultural artifacts, focusing on the traditional Sri Lankan bridal regalia. Methods. The research involves a practice-based research method to decode and record the cosmopolitan identities embodied in the traditional jewelry items. The bridal jewelry artifacts are selected from the collections of family heirlooms to ensure authenticity. It draws on an annotated visual documentation of the bridal regalia through my renderings of jewelry. It documents the traditional iconography based on the photographs. I developed precise hand-rendered drawings. My drawings for this research aim to bridge the sensory and semantic gaps in the digital images of the jewelry artifacts. The sensory gap is the loss of data in a reproduced image compared to the physical object. By reducing the sensory gap, the processes of tracing and the rendering assist me extract the subtle details in the designs, iconography, material, and the manufacturing process of the artifacts conveyed in high-resolution digital images. The semantic gap is the space between the features or information extracted from the visual data and the user interpretation of the same data. Bridging the semantic gap for future users, the renderings of this research are annotated not only with physical details, but also with the cultural meanings of the symbols incorporated into the artifacts. Traditional Sri Lankan bridal regalia refers to the ensemble of the bridal jewelry worn in Kandy. My rationale for selecting traditional bridal regalia for this research is that it records the cosmopolitan history of cultural influences, revisions, and renewals over several generations in Sri Lanka. The bridal regalia brings together a cosmopolitan array of symbols from Asian traditions as well as Buddhist beliefs that are each connected to the layered histories of Sri Lanka and its neighboring countries in the Indian Ocean. The various interactions of Sri Lanka with waves of Portuguese, Dutch, and British colonization are also appropriated and adapted in the jewellery heritage of Sri Lanka. Appadura describes the Kandyan kingdom as a first-rate ethnography because of its inclusion of the many cultural dynamics and tensions. Kandyan crafts came to be seen as the authentic relics of the nation by the leaders of the nationalist movement and the British colonizers in the early 20th century. In the production of a local culture that was distinct from the influences of Western modernity circulating among the Sri Lankan community during British colonization, the jewellery of the Kandyan aristocracy in the 1800s, as shown in figure 2, was imagined by the nationalist movement in the 1920s as an ensemble that was considered suitable for bridal regalia in wedding ceremonies, as shown in figure 3. This is a wedding portrait of the mid-20th century Sri Lanka. In this process, the nationalist movement, a set of conventions for Sinhala Buddhist identity, was imagined, and it unable to trace the history of cosmopolitan of Sri Lankan cultures. In contrast, the recent waves of globalization have tended to erode the cosmopolitan character of the traditional iconography of the Sri Lankan bridal regalia by replacing the traditional elements with modifications, as shown in figure 5. To counter the further dilution of the traditional jewellery forms that embodied the cosmopolitan identity of Sri Lanka, this paper attempts to preserve the traditional iconography through annotated drawings. It documents the traditional jewellery designs, the iconography, and the embodied cultural meanings, and reimagine the historical cosmopolitanism and the diverse cultural identities that comprise contemporary Sri Lanka. I will show 3 examples from the bridal artifacts that I have rendered and documented. Through the drawings, I try to extract the subtle details of the traditional designs, materials, and the iconography that embody different cultural influences. Figure 6 shows 2 jewellery items that symbolize the sun and the moon placed on either side of the bride's head. These symbols represent the enduring relationship of the bride and the groom. In Sinhalese tradition, the sun refers to masculinity and the moon to femininity. These adornments express the South Indian influences. Figure 7 shows a traditional form of hairpin. All the elements symbolize the lotus motif, in particularly the rosettes of the lotus. The rosette is a remarkable motif for many other cultures. For example, it is prominent in Oriental art, while the rose rosette is employed in medieval English art. The lotus rosette is used for Indian and Sri Lankan traditional art. This is a pendant that expresses the motif of the double-head bird. It is an icon in both Eastern and Western cultures. The motif evidenced in the arms of Russia and Austria, where it is known as the double-headed eagle, and possibly derived from the Eastern history of heraldry. Sri Lankan custom interprets the symbol as one of collaboration. This motif in bridal artifacts express the expected partnership of the marriage. Okay, this is the conclusion of my presentation. The reshaped global cultural flows due to the COVID-19 pandemic signified new networks and collaborations between nation and the state. The potential for creating new social imaginaries between the different communities in Sri Lanka laid the foundation for this research to reimagine its early cosmopolitanism, to reappreciate the diverse cultural identities. The annotated drawings of the traditional Sri Lankan bridal regalia employed for the study to decode and record the embodied cosmopolitanism of the Sri Lankan cultural artifacts. The research aimed to reimagine and bring cosmopolitanism through an intercultural dialogue based on a rich craft heritage of Sri Lanka. It will facilitate as a resource for future generations to reimagine the history of cosmopolitanism in Sri Lanka. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Absolutely exquisite work and presentation. Thank you so very much indeed. I really welcome questions from our audience. We have some experts here very much. Kevin Murray, just noting your comments in the chat there. It would be interesting to get the perspective of contemporary makers on these forms. I agree. There's something about something that happens in the rendering as drawing that shifts it, if you like, materially and temporally. There's something very curious that happens in your process, your methodology there, Inoka, for me. Quite exquisite, and so resonant with our keynote speaker discussing cosmopolitanism this morning. And indeed, you had the cosmos there with the sun and the moon, so thank you. So if there aren't any other questions, and please feel free to add them into the chat. Thank you indeed, Inoka, Zoe and Katherine. Absolutely thrilled, and hope we do have the chance to see the work in whatever reality we can share in due course. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, so moving along to the final presentation, and it will be a little different. So we have Emeritus Professor Denise Ferris and Dr. Mark Edgoose and myself presenting something of a perhaps a roundtable or an open forum, a very live paper presentation on the topic of situating craft. I will run the slides and just try and manage the conversation. And Denise, I think, will be opening for us, very much in dialogue with Dr. Mark Edgoose. And I think our goal is to really encourage discussion as we go through this. So Denise, I'll hand over to you to articulate next steps.
All right, thanks. Great to see you, Rod. People have been bouncing in saying, are we going to really come into the presenters thing? I'm like, no, not at all. I lied. So look, what we really do want to do here is, I've got to say, you've just got your emails up in the presenter form kit, but you're going to get rid of it was, I put in the words in red last night, just a provocation. So we do want to talk about issues and solutions. There are lots of issues in and around craft, as we know, as we lose disciplines, etc. So we'll go to the next slide. Craft sits in a brave new world, we say. So we come to the conclusion that things are changing. Some things are staying the same, but some things are changing. Mark has a perspective on that in terms of students.
Is that oh, that's a cue, is it?
Mark.
Fantastic. No, yeah, look, I've got perspectives on that, but I thought we might just start with the global perspective, and so we'll keep the script, okay, Denise, if that's all right.
Yeah. We'll just go to if people can just read this, because we're not sure who has read our simple that we sent out and who isn't. So we're on this second slide. We'll go to the third one, Kit, and that's the global slide. So we'll just sit on that. Yeah.
And I'm not seeing the slides either, so that's probably problematic. Anyway, look, just quickly, I just thought it's take the opportunity that recently we had the JMGA conference, Value Chains Reset, that Kevin Murray very generously brought it all together for the universities and the membership. So just looking at some of the things that came from that, particularly with China and how things are developing there. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but Teo Biffé, through his presentation, gave us a few insights into, like over the last 14 years, 400 art and design schools established, approximately 300 VE schools, 300,000 students plus doing art and design courses in 2020. Interestingly, parents see it as a respectable and a career and are very supportive. But obviously there is less reliance on Western universities now in educating craft in China, mainly due that we have actually done the hard work, educated Chinese students through masters and PhDs, and now they're back in China leading very strong programs and establishing themselves strong careers. And I think it's really clear that craft in China is very narrative in the fact that symbols, ritual patterns are really the key. Norman Cherry, Kevin described him as the Pied Piper who brought Chinese students to the UK about 25 years ago. Talked about there's an increase in 20% increase in Chinese students studying art and design in 2020. So around about 100,000 Chinese students studying in the UK, 25,000 studying A&D programs. But incredibly, this is at the same time that there's been a reduction of about 36% in courses. So work that one out. But what is probably important in Chinese studying overseas is that it seems to be more about the experience of studying. So the coffee shop is as important as the studio, and it's not necessarily about learning craft and skill sets, because that seems to be happening more and more in China.
Okay, so people are looking at this, and these are the questions, I guess, that we want people to think about. So if you've got a burning desire to answer one of these questions, or say it's rubbish, or say it's onto something, please don't hold back. So we'll move to the next one, so we can just kind of whip through the things. So how do you keep a craft discipline going? Pointy question. I mean, obviously, in some places, we have not been able to, no matter what evidence you could draw, no matter how good that situation was. And so, looking back at the first presentation today and thinking about issues of consortia, I mean, we have also, Mark and I have also been discussing, I've discussed this with Kit, about the notion of universities sharing, us sharing across first year, second year, even third year, and maybe then we all take into honours, but us sharing disciplines across universities in ways that might keep what universities might consider arcane disciplines, or disciplines that they just can't see the viability of, or they can't see the numbers, or it doesn't add up for the bean counters. So, I mean, I think those are all possibilities we have to look at. We really have to consider how we might be able to achieve some of those things. So we would really welcome any feedback. And it was really wonderful to see the first presentation with respect to those connections. And David Cross and I have been having conversation in the chat about those possibilities. Yeah.
And Denise, how do you see that happening when we can't even share courses within a university? Yeah,
look, difficulty. To be frank with you, when we had a DVC she was pretty courageous. She's no longer at the university where I am an Emerita. I really thought there was a chance so we could have a bit of a crack at it, to be honest. I think it requires great vision, great courage, and people who, you know, it's difficult. You know, who gets the money when we teach a 50-50 course with medicine? You know, somewhere gets the money and then eventually you might get paid back, but you may not get paid back. You know, how the funding works is very, very complex at universities. And people are always really worried about that. You know, the middle management is always worried about that. So, it's difficult.
Yeah, and I also wonder whether, you know, whether we've got it all a little bit wrong, that, you know, we're constantly asked in the schools, you know, what are we going to do about it? Well, you know, maybe the question's back to university leadership to show some courage and provide learning and teaching frameworks that we can mobilise. You know, it's and not you know, kowtow to, you know, the loudest voice, the wealthiest school, you know, all these sorts of things that seem to get in the way of these really important discussions. You know, so you know, what L&T framework can actually exist to allow us to work together, you know, both within universities and between universities.
Sure.
About architecture.
Yeah, go, Kit.
Kevin,
yes, if I could just contribute something to this. It's fantastic that this issue has been brought up, and congratulations for making ACUADS accessible to the world. With the World Crafts Council, one of our projects recently was the Encyclopedia of Craft in the Asia Pacific. That's now gone on to other continents, but it unlocked a network of craft scholars or craft experts from our region. And the natural step beyond that was to develop an association of those scholars, which has led to the creation of a knowledge house for craft. And that's currently working with a consortia of craft institutes, such as the Institute of Craft and Design in Jaipur, Tsinghua University, which is the major kind of craft education centre in China, Sandra Alfordi Institute of Craft in Nova Scotia, and a variety of others. And the basis for this is a new generation of knowledge graphs that go by various platforms, Obsidian, Craft Research, which allow for collaboration in knowledge production. So the major project is around the value of craft. It's a compilation of all the information and evidence, which is a kind of foundational project for many of us. But the principle is that, you know, in most universities, particularly given the scale of the university, and obviously ANU was subject to a lot of that pressure in terms of how to deal with a bespoke specialist course when you've got such scale, is to find alliances between institutes, not just nationally but internationally. And while the current institutional structure maybe makes that difficult, and this today seems to be an attempt to resist that, to look for collaborations, there are, I think, platforms around that can be explored to both share that in terms of projects for research, but also for learning and teaching. It's like they're kind of Wikipedia kind of platforms that enable bidirectional linking and so on. So a sense of the holistic nature of the knowledge, which provides a much more interesting collaborative base. And I'm happy to share more of that if there's interest.
Yeah. I think what people need to understand, and putting on my my Associate Dean Education kind of hat, is the complexity of how you actually insert these more flexible modes into university sort of governance. You know, at the end of the day, they count up units and you get a degree. So I agree, Fiona, when you write into the chat that there's no shortage of a collaborative research projects. There's no shortage of collaborations, to be frank. What there's a shortage of is at undergraduate level of cross learning and teaching, of how do we make that happen if we're thin on the ground here, you know, or do we designate one institution, you only teach glass, we only teach textiles, you only, you know, like, how do we make it kind of work if we care that much about retaining our craft disciplines in Australia at certain levels? You know, we can't just ignore people. When I first floated the design degree, my Vice Chancellor said to me, can we just start at masters? And I said, where would you like those students to come from? I mean, you know, like really, you know, I'm sorry, but you know, they just don't appear from, you know, Sydney and Melbourne, especially if you live in Canberra. So I think those difficulties, they're not intractable, but there's some of the things we've got to kind of keep in mind. Mark, you want to move to the next one?
Yeah, just before we do, I just think, you know, we also got to consider what we teach and how we teach it. I mean, it's all very well to say, you know, let's combine things and let's things like that, you know, do things like that. But, you know, there's just, and following on from what Kevin was saying about the importance of sort of material knowledge, you know, there's just strong evidence that cognitive learning works very well when you're teaching skill. And at an undergraduate level, this needs to happen before we get into any more of the sort of you know, inquiry-based learning that we encourage in, you know, further down the track. So, you know, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Or does it? Mark and I have also had a discussion, as I have previously with Kit, about unlearning. Do we have students with none of those technical skills who are all about inquiry-based projects? Yeah. And do we just flip it and take it from the other side?
Well, research says it doesn't work. Research says that it takes longer and it's much more difficult. And if COVID has shown us anything, it's that it is staff, you know, the difficulties for staff to teach students online and not have that sort of cognitive studio experience. You know, they all need a holiday.
Andrew Lavery, over to you.
Yeah, Andrew.
Yes. Why don't I suggest we look at it from a different perspective? Because I think the articulation agreements that we used to have with other universities where we share some of our curriculum, etc. We had a craft discipline, we had an agreement with UNSW, for example. Every university has withdrawn everything because normally the student would move over to the discipline they're working in. But look, I really do think there are internal systems within universities that are roadblocking the students that might want to go into a craft discipline. Yep. One is protectionism amongst the bigger studios. They're just very, very good at funneling students into their big studios. So they'll all end up in painting. And there's a herd mentality. If they see their friends going there, well, they'll think, oh, that must be the best studio, which is not necessarily the case. So I think one is the internal systems. The other is exposing students to craft because they don't get exposed to craft in like the high school system anymore. That's very rare. So they do to the traditional disciplines like painting and photography. So I think there's a lot that can be done at curriculum level to address these problems. We actually have a really unusual batch of students here at SCA at the moment. We have 15 students in jewellery and object, and we've worked out that that just came down to a really good introduction in foundation that was carefully structured, and that studio at the moment is bigger than some of the traditionally large ones, which is proof that you know, if you set up good systems and a good introduction to the crafts disciplines, that you might be able to homogenise things a little bit more in terms of getting students out into those disciplines and making them more viable. And I don't think we don't look at that very often. And you'll get the big protectionists stepping in amongst your academic staff. And I think we need to push against that a bit because you really want healthy numbers across all of your disciplines. It's a last resort to go and cut your craft disciplines, I think. Most deans or directors, you know, they want a comprehensive art school with as many disciplines and facilities as possible. So yeah, that's my suggestion. Look at it from a different angle. I think sharing is something I'm actually not that interested in doing because it's just so complicated, and it's harder than it used to be.
Yeah.
It is incredibly difficult, and yet I'm amazed that there are growing examples of it. You know, I was really struck yesterday with the Creative Industries Federation talking about that cluster of universities in the Midlands of the UK coming together on curriculum. Now, they're regional, so in the sense they are proximity. They're more like neighbours, which is more challenging in Australia if we're talking about the large urban hubs of Melbourne, Canberra, Sydney, etc. But I'm intrigued. They did say it was early days. They hadn't figured it all out. I'm sure the devil is, of course, in the detail. But this trend may be coming anyway. Denise, we're on slide 5. Should I
keep moving? And look, I'd just like to mention, Rowan's put into the chat, he's quite right. 15 first year jewellery and object at ANU was considered not viable by the middle management. Now, I should assure you that the craft disciplines at ANU didn't close because there was anything wrong with them or because they weren't viable. They had some of the most interesting PhD students enrolled, particularly in jewellery and object. There are a whole range of other issues which I won't go into because I did go into that for 5 minutes yesterday. I'm still smarting. But look, I think next slide, you know, what does viability look like? You know, that's a question actually not for us in a way. So, you know, should we, yeah, thanks, so, that's good, thanks. Should we push craft to be a third entity? And Zoe's put into the chat object design at University of New South Wales, you know, where it's much more integrated, which is exactly what was happening, you know, with Rowan's area in the past, and certainly is happening with Rod Bamford's in the audience today from ceramics at ANU School of Art and Design. So then we bring in some of the things that happened yesterday. We're talking about industry, we're talking about the VE sector, we're talking about other you know, possibilities as well, not just those words on the page, but other possibilities. And then the last pointy thing that we bunged in, Mark and I, was should ACUADS have a policy on craft? Should they be going and wagging their finger at the dean of whatever and saying, you know, how can you possibly, like, you know, how can this happen?
And yeah, so yeah, I'd love a policy. But the third identity argument too is that you know, differentiation is critical. You know, we have different histories. We have a praxis learning model that perhaps is not always engaged in some of the pursuits and I'm also thinking of international identity. You know, I think it's arguable that you know, some of our courses have lost that international identity due to this idea of we are considered you know, locked in with other programs, and so I think it's important that we do look at distinctions, and particularly around, you know, obviously the material sort of quality of how we work.
Yep. Okay, let's cut to 8 and then 9, and we should be, and we've got a hidden slide which has got some more you know, grass, more pragmatic sort of suggestions. Okay, yeah, the point that other people have been making in the chat, Zoe included, you know, craft's an aspect of all material disciplines. So, you know, how do we mix that up with other disciplines? How do we, you know, what's another way of looking at it so that craft is absolutely picked up by all disciplines? I mean, it's what we attempted with the design degree program at ANU. And it was really kind of the cavalry if we had lower numbers in very small studios, as Kevin Murray just points out. How would you fit 40 people in there? You know what? You wouldn't. So, I mean, until a new building arrived, et cetera, yeah, sort of holding patterns. But by the same token, when we talk about, you know, reading Rowan and Nick Rubens's paper, Calling for Innovation, when we call for innovation in craft and to be more collaborative and join things, you know, we've got to be careful that some of our colleagues just do fall into that trap of technical skills, of it being sort of just about technical skills and not about being able to play with everyone.
But is that true? Do you think we've moved on from that as a like I you know, when we talk about disciplines, what are we talking about? Are we talking about engineering? And engineering who have a strong material practice, that material isn't technique to them. Material is a way of thinking, about solving problems, creating problems, you know, solutions to all sorts of things. So So I'm not sure that I think it's craft that is its own problem there about saying we're only material and technically proficient. We are so much bigger than that.
Yep, I agree. I totally agree. Look, I wrote down before when the first presentation was happening in this session, the irony of craft and job ready, as if what could be more practical than to give people a deep knowledge and understanding materials and ideas to apply them. I mean, it's ironic, that therefore craft is not positioned, by middle management as sort of being job ready. Anyway, we'll go to the next slide.
And we had a UK expert out a year or so ago who's doing a PhD in that. And very interesting about the professional quality. For instance, is exhibition the only outcome? Yeah. In an art school. Yeah. Very, very important, that one. And that's something that, Rowan, you've spoken about in the past. And I think so many more of our projects now are just not wanting art and design to come up with stuff. They're wanting art and design to come up with ideas and the vision, not just stuff. So I think that really does matter too. So this is our second last slide, which you can read for yourselves. And then our last slide is just throwing down some things about, how we might go, but very interested to hear what other people also might think on that last slide. Well, I must have rights here. Knowledge systems, obviously, First Nations contributions is a big key, particularly at RMIT, obviously. And if the bushfires of 2020 taught us anything, it taught us, it showed us some of those knowledge systems that can play out. And so in NODAC week in I think it was 2020, Ludwig, who's a trend forecaster, talks about how the relevance of post-COVID craft and how there's a worldwide shift to align this sort of deeper understanding and appreciation of Indigenous crafts. And so we're already there. We're already doing that. In both, perhaps less so in undergraduate, but certainly in research. It's very big. Okay, so last slide. Happy for anyone to jump in, please. And people are jumping in the chat. Very happy for people to unmute and have a shot at speaking. There's lots of good stuff going in the chat. Go, Ro.
Can you nice, you got me? You can hear me?
Yep, all good.
Hi, folks. No, that's really interesting, and I just sort of thought I'd sit back and let you folks finish your slides before I chipped in. But I think one of the biggest issues we have is craft's flexibility, and the fact that it is art, it is capable of operating in the realms of design and, obviously in the narrower channel of craft. And given that flexibility, it's within a 3-year degree, really difficult to shoehorn all those diverse things that craft can offer into that sort of small sequence of units or courses or subjects, whatever they're called, depending on the institution you're in. And furthermore, into these what are smaller allotments of time that each of those courses are. I mean, many of the people in this chat would have gone to university in a time when we turned up at art school on Monday morning at 9 o'clock and left at 5 o'clock on Friday, and we're in the studio the whole time in this kind of undefined lesson that ran through the whole week. I don't think I ever got a course outline in my entire time at university, and it was a one-on-one engagement with my lecturers. Now, that was a rich learning environment, which was at one end problematic, had lots of flaws in it, and we often talk about this magical past, but there was some bits that weren't too magic, but there was also lots of good stuff about it as well. And today we're trying to teach these things in very compressed formats, and so what we can achieve in that time is really small. And I just think the conversation needs to be really real about what we can achieve in those times.
I agree, Ron. So why are we teaching? What's the role of VE? if we're talking that skills are important to craftspeople. We acknowledge that secondary schools no longer teach it. So
what's VE?
Sorry, vocational education.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Yep.
Probably different from each state. Yeah. So there's craft courses in VE that are very skill based. But we've also got to acknowledge that they're opening up, and there's a freedom coming into that. And currently, one of them's offering a master's. So there's duality sort of starting to creep into the higher ed and VE sector as well.
Look, I don't know why we're teaching craft necessarily in institutions, just to be a bit of an outlier there. And I think maybe, as Denise suggested before, I think about craft practitioners, and we continue to learn our whole life, technical skills and conceptual skills.
Yeah.
And perhaps we can front end the conceptual skills, which are probably better delivered in a university context.
Yeah.
And then you do, of course, acquire those technical skills, which perhaps to a lesser and lesser extent can be taught in universities. And I know that those two things are not able to be pulled apart and totally. I know craft, you do think through materials and so on, but I'm just sort of putting it out there that there has to be an acknowledgement of what the constraints are in the tertiary institution.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. But I think the confusion may be there a little bit that concept is a skill too. When we talk about skill, we talk about concept and we talk about material. What I was trying to identify before was that the way we teach that through cognitive or the student-led approach, and that the evidence says that the student-led approach is really slow and takes an awful lot of work, and you can do it a lot faster. So if we're looking at structures, why are we teaching 12-week semesters? Why aren't we doing intensives where we get the job done in half the time? Then that opens up the studio. So potentially you could have short courses that make you more viable. And these are sort of the outcomes that we need to be thinking about to convince the bean counters, as Denise says. I'll shut up now.
I'm going to support our chair now and suggest that because the three presentations have got, really do have alignments, that we just now finish our specific discussion and roll into a broader discussion. Is that okay with everyone on the panels? And there's someone's hand up, but I can't tell who.
Roderick, I think, has bravely put his hand up there.
Oh, so, right. Yeah, Rod, please go, because you put something in the chat. Thank you.
So, Rod, feel free to put the camera and microphone on, if possible.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes, we can.
Thanks. Thanks for the invitation, letting me know, Denise, and for the open session. I think that's terrific. I just wanted to join together a couple of really interesting points that I've been sort of listening to in the conversation. The idea of this idea of open collaboration, I think, is really important. I think it's extremely difficult to do across institutions, notwithstanding some of those initiatives in the Midlands of the UK. And there was an interesting international master's degree initiative, which I didn't really gain a lot of traction because of its expense and complexity when I was working at the RCA, which connected institutions globally. It was a model that there was a lot of interest in, but those questions that you pointed to, Denise, about who pays for what and which part of the degree is recognised by which institution were really stumbling blocks. But it raised really interesting possibilities about this notion of intensives, which Mark just mentioned. And one of the things I think that there might be in a practical sense, there might be a different way of approaching some of these problems by looking really pragmatically. And one of the models that's emerging that I can point to, which is not within art and craft or design, but it happens across universities in lab management, is this development of research centres and the farming out of essentially opportunities for research to take place in labs that are specialised in using certain equipment. And there's an online platform called, it's got the most dreadful name, called Cluster Market. Really is a shocker. But what it does is it enables this to be all quantified and managed and costed. And it seems to me, and I'm looking at that currently as a way of managing the workshop at ANU, just simply because it offers a lot of facilities. It's a bit like, you know, setting up some sort of, medical facility or something with all of these buttons and ways of connecting. But what it does is that it opens up the possibility of the workshop being a model of the workshop being managed in ways that might make intensives more easier, which can bring a sort of quantifiable perspective to it, which I think is quite different from looking at it from a curriculum perspective. So I just wanted to sort of throw that out there, and also to think that what that means is that we probably do have to think about different ways of teaching, and in fully recognising that we can only fit a certain number of students in a workshop around particular safety requirements, and indeed the numbers that are going to make a reasonable or deliver a reasonable sort of pedagogical outcome. I still think that there's room to actually, there's room to look at that, and in particular to look at how craft disciplines can be part of larger degrees or fields of practice, such as engineering, design, design engineering, architecture, archaeology, etc. So yeah, I just want that. So they're my thoughts for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rod. And I mean, your wealth of experience is really invaluable in this discussion. I'm just trying to link back to the first paper in particular, just that resonance with consortia. And Fiona or David, I think, has had to leave, Katie or Cameron. I feel that sometimes there is a secret language you need to speak to get things across the line. And sometimes, community can be one. Industry is another, which I'm using quite deliberately here. Craft may or may not be the right word to use. But I wonder if you have any dark magic that you discovered in the treatment project to help build those sorts of possibilities. Universities do seem to innovate when those words are spoken.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if Cam's still in the room. I was just going to throw in how industry is of these kind of engagements. They love, particularly non-arts industry areas like the Western treatment plant, the Altona treatment plant. They really love the engagement that artists have and the new views that they are given opportunity or access to through the eyes of multiple artists telling stories and renewing ideas of what their industry is. It's really quite potent and powerful, I think.
Yes.
I think that's beautifully said. Engagement is one of those words, and I couldn't. It is so apparent in craft, of course, the histories and traditions, the connections that craft practices make. Obviously, manifest engagement in one strand. Cameron, I don't know if you have any last thoughts, and we'll probably begin to wrap up.
Yeah, sorry, kid, I was just welcoming home a 12-year-old. The thing that I was at pains to point out is we didn't start out with a plan. It all started with a very small conversation, and from there we built the alliances. So those alliances across disciplines inside the arts, for us talking to Fiona and asking her on board to come and be an artist in that second treatment actually kickstarted a PhD for her, which is now fed into her career back at RMIT. So it's this kind of alliance building that the project itself has allowed us to do, and start to and opened up ways of thinking about pedagogy in that space in a much different way. So it's a situated kind of practice, yes, site-responsive public artworks in running across multiple disciplines, but also as kind of a situated pedagogy that numerous institutions can work into.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, great example. Yep. Rod's got his hand up, but Rod, I'm not sure if it's because
no, I haven't yet. I've spoken.
Okay, sorry.
Down again, sorry.
Didn't mean to call you. No, not at all. Not at all. Not at all. All right.
Okay. Look, I think we are sort of probably needing to wrap up, especially to give time to get to the very last session of the afternoon. But I do think if we transcribe this, which is part of our intention, just the sort of free-form conversation, to pick out some of these commonalities, these strands, these strategies, I think we may have a roadmap for craft going forward. So watch this space.
Yep.
Denise, Mark, my thanks indeed for allowing me to play alongside.
Thank you. Thank you. Oliver's got something in the chat, but we're going to save the chat, aren't we, so that we can go through it. Thanks so much, colleagues. This was honestly just a 15-minute beginning, because we all know these conversations have to happen. And it's been so great to have them with your great minds.
So does that mean the answer is yes, that ACUADS is going to have a policy?
We've got a working party. Does that help?
We certainly do. And this session was sort of framed with that in mind. But again, Cameron, Fiona, others, it'd be fascinating to cross-reference. Zoe, Rohan, etc. Thank you all. All of our presenters, a really rich and dynamic session. It certainly put a spring in my step. See you at 4 o'clock, everybody, for the wrap-up, as we're going to focus on well-being initially, what we've learned, how we sustain ourselves, how we thrive, indeed, during these times and going forward. And then don't miss the grants and the awards at the end of the afternoon. See you there.
Thanks so much.